thank you all for joining us tonight. I'm speaking in lieu of our worshipful master, Pedro Guerrero, who unfortunately had a family emergency and was unable to attend this night, but he wanted me to give you all fraternal greetings, say thank you for joining, and that he wishes he could be here with us. We have a great speaker, a great program. I'm going to talk less and let worshipful brother Adam Goldman give the intro to our speaker, Brother Lamb, this evening. Worshipful brother Goldman.
Thank you, worshipful. I think we're going to do a quick, if I'm not mistaken, Joe, are you going to do a quick plug for Refracted Light and then I'll go?
We can do that after. Brother Jaime asked, because he heard about what's going on with our worshipful. He asked if we could do a nice little prayer for him before we get started with the festivities.
Okay, you want to do that now or after? Yeah, probably do that before I introduce Jaime then.
Yeah, okay. So everybody, like I said, our worshipful is having a not awesome family crisis. So if we could all assume an attitude of prayer. We can do that out. Worshipful Creator of heaven and earth, please care for and keep in your arms our dear brother and his family. See them through the darkness to a greater light, and may they know your love and warmth and care and the radiance of your loving grace, and bless them through this time of trouble, and let them know that they have the love and affection and care and support of everyone here and everyone who is worthy to call him brother. Amen.
So mote be.
Great, thank you, Joe. With that, yeah, it is certainly my honor to introduce tonight's speaker. I'll say that, what I've said before, some of you know I'm also the Grand Order, in addition to being BBF's order, Benjamin B. French number 15. And as Grand Order, that position, I sent out a message along with the Grand Masters the other day that said, you know what, COVID's horrible, house arrest sucks. But the bright and silver lining of all this has been Masonic education. It's just, we've never seen it like this. It's honestly just awe-inspiring to get the likes of a Jamie Lamb or an Angel Millar, or, all these, amazing speakers to present during this time is just, it's really just, been humbling. And the first time I saw Jamie happened to be at Joe's event, Esoteric On. And certainly I knew a lot of the names like those and Piers Vaughn and others that were going to be there, Greg Kaminsky. And but I hadn't heard, or at that point I hadn't read Myth, Magic, and Masonry. And so, I kind of knew what to expect with Greg and Piers and others. Even P.D. Newman, but when Jamie came out, I was just awestruck that here's this guy that had so much to say about Masonry, that was revealing some of the deepest secrets that were layers that had heretofore not been revealed to a lot of guys, and he did it with such humility and humbleness, and I was just absolutely awestruck by the presentation that day, talking about the Anno Lucas and the Taurian age in Masonry and also the Mithraic stuff. Later, I read his book, and I in my role as Grand Order and Order of BBF, I had the opportunity to invite him to DC, and he's just been this amazing friend to DC Freemasonry and really national Freemasonry ever since. But I had the honor and privilege of bringing him out to DC, and he did a 2-day event. He did the Anno Lucas and Myth, Magic, and Masonry and explained that at Benjamin B. French Lodge. Next day, he went to William R. Singleton, where he prepared a special event. The sitting master, John Zavidas, he wanted a presentation on Greek mythology, and anyone that knows Jamie knows that he has an eidetic memory for mythology, and he sees it, from not just the the academic side, but he sees it from numerous sides, including Masonic and the Western esoteric traditions. So ever since, he's been, near and dear to my heart, and I know he's worked with a lot of other Masons around the country and just always makes time for us. And so when I, knew the new book was coming out, I knew that was something that we needed to do through this platform, both Refracted Light and Benjamin B. French. So I won't take any more of your time, just to tell you that, it's an honor and privilege to introduce Jaime.
Thank you, Adam. Can you hear me okay?
Perfect.
And thanks for bringing up my the depths of my humility, which are only really matched by the heights of my wisdom and knowledge. But I kid. So yeah, thanks Joe and Refracted Light for setting this up. I really do feel close to DC Freemasonry, and I feel, I know this is BBF, but I feel like Singleton is really my home away from home. No, I'm kidding. Both of you. BBF and Singleton are very special to me. And truly, kidding aside, my heart goes out, as all of ours does, to worshipful Master Pedro, and in this time of grieving and mourning for him and his family. So I'm going to share screen now. I'm going to share my screen. Can you see that? Somebody?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay. Okay, I'm going to talk about my new book that came out on the 24th. It's called Approaching the Middle Chamber, the 7 Liberal Arts in Freemasonry and the Western Esoteric Tradition. And I wanted to tell you that, this is the product of a couple of years of research, and what really sort of led me to want to take on what you'll find, hopefully you'll see as a pretty monumental project, is that, as we get to the fellowcraft degree, as Masons know, there's, we're presented with a particular curriculum, and we kind of blow right by it. We hear it in the lecture, and it's such a moving lecture with so much meat on the bone. I mean, there's so much to take apart and so much to contemplate, but it seemed rare to me for us to sort of take it on, whether in a group setting or even individually. I know I hadn't done it, when I was past, and even look at the word past, it connotes that sort of, just breezing right by. Oh, I'm past that. Now I'm on my way to Master Mason, and then I've arrived on the level, as it were, and it seems like everybody's just looking to get to that point. And this sort of interstitial grade that we need to, we just stop there so briefly, kind of survey it, and then we're off, to the next degree. And I felt like, okay, that to me is the entirety of our curriculum. We're given this this lecture, which I'm going to I go through it minutely in the book, point by point in the order that it's presented in that lecture, and I use those as springboards for further examination of each of those topics contained there. But another thing I wanted to get across was that Arnold van Gennep, he's an anthropologist who coined the phrase rite of passage, right? And he noticed that there was an anthropological constant in initiatory systems worldwide since time immemorial that that broke these systems into sort of 3 parts that he was able to distinguish that commonly happened. And they were preliminal rites, liminal rites, and post-liminal rites. And he noticed that the characteristic of each was separation, transformation, and reintegration. So in that order. And I'm not the first to remark that Freemasonry contains an intact initiatory system per Van Gennep's criteria that he sort of laid out, right? So as an entered apprentice, we are separated by our obligation. We are separated from the fold, or from the sort of from other men. Let's say we're separated by the tenets and points in our obligation. We're sometimes literally separated by being sequestered in certain areas and things like that. There's so much thematic separation happening in that first degree. In the second degree, which is the liminal right, according to Van Gennep, and that is transformation. In that second degree, we are transformed. Ostensibly, we are transformed. I say ostensibly because it doesn't always happen, you know, because the literature on Freemasonry, from what I've been able to find, is largely pretty anemic on teaching the 7 liberal arts, let's say, or even addressing them in any meaningful, less than, more than superficial way. And then at the Master Mason degree, finishing the Van Gennep scheme of initiatory kind of motifs, right? In the Master Mason degree, we are charged to go back into society and propagate the teachings of Freemasonry by our actions and by our demeanor and by how we present ourselves in the world. So we're reintegrated into society. We've been separated, we've been transformed, and then we are reintegrated not only with each other on the level, but we are reintegrated into society a better man. They talk about making good men better. And I believe Freemasonry does that. What I've keyed in on in approaching the middle chamber is trying to address that that deficiency that I've found personally in how we approach the Fellowcraft degree, and particularly the lecture of the Fellowcraft degree, colloquially the middle chamber lecture. And my first reason for wanting to do that was that I felt like I wasn't passed. I felt like I didn't present a master's piece. I didn't present my work. There was nothing that I came to, other than some, proficiency and memorization and sign scripts and words, things like that. I never felt truly passed vis-a-vis that lecture. So my initial impetus for writing this book is, okay, I'm going to personally take on this curriculum. So I began to do that, and then in my notes, starting to collect notes, etc., I found that, okay, this is obviously going to be a manuscript, and if you know anything about my other work, Myth, Magic, and Masonry, or if you know me personally, or you see my Facebook posts, I'm deeply interested in Western esotericism and the occult. It just happens to be my vantage point from which I survey some of our work. I'm not saying, now this is another kind of disclaimer, I'm not saying that something like, say, tarot symbolism is inherent in the work of Freemasonry. I'm not saying that we find it in situ in our rituals and symbolism and our allegory. If you're thinking I'm making that argument, you're wrong. I don't necessarily see it in there. Do I see Freemasonry in the tarot? Certainly I see it in Rider-Waite imagery, right? With the pillars on the High Priestess card, etc., but not vice versa per se. But that being said, it is a vantage point, right? It is what you would call a critical perspective. So when I was younger, I read a lot of Baudrillard, I read Guy Debord, I read Walter Benjamin, literary criticism, things like that. I was just interested in it. I've always been interested in establishing a critical perspective or several critical perspectives, and then zeroing in on my subject and synthesizing a view of my subject. You know, not merely just saying, okay, this is what I was handed, this is what I'm going to believe, you know, this is what I'm going to take it at superficial face value. No, for me, it's been about this analogous method of trying to take apart my subject and reassemble it in a way that I can understand it. And, you know, some people find value in that, and I hope you do, because that's the entirety of what my stuff is about, you know. Now, granted, I'm not trying to please everybody. I know I'm just burning this slide out. Let's get on to another slide. So when we take that literary or cultural perspective, we can apply it to things like say if you establish a mythological perspective, you know, you can apply that to the cinema, for example. You could see, oh, like you brought up P.D. Newman earlier. He and I talk a few times a week. He's a dear friend, and he texted me. He was like, you ever notice the sort of planetary pantheon represented in The Breakfast Club? How Emilio Estevez is sort of the martial archetype. You know, he's Mars or Aries, and Ali Sheedy is sort of lunar. She's kind of the Hecate sort of lunar archetypal thing, on and on, etc. And we've talked like that about many things on many levels, and it's a perspective. It's a critical perspective. So from the perspective of mythology on, in this case, The Breakfast Club, but you can apply it to all kinds of literature. You can apply it to you know, art, television shows, movies, etc. Now, I've done that from the perspective of the greater Western esoteric tradition to Freemasonry and the 7 liberal arts and sciences. So that's what my book is about. So in a sentence, my book is about a multifaceted perspective based on subjects found in the Western esoteric tradition, which I've applied to the Fellowcraft lecture, and particularly the 7 liberal arts and sciences. So here's an example. You see how let me turn this to laser pointer. Okay, you see how we have the globes here. We know in the lecture tells us that there's network, lilywork, and pomegranates on here, right? So when I think pomegranates, it just floods my mind that I think of it, not only exuberance and plenty, right? But I also think of Adonis, whose spilled blood is said to be where the first pomegranates grew. I think of Persephone, who on her ascent from Hades, after being let go by Hades, he gave her either sometimes 4, sometimes 6 pomegranate seeds, and she had to spend 4 or 6 months in the underworld with Hades. So I think of narratives like that, and the value, I think, in this is that it adds depth to the experience, right? So if you just think, oh, pomegranates, cool, I've seen that in the grocery store, you know, or I had those at a Middle Eastern restaurant, or, oh, I drink palm juice. I mean, yeah, that's a perspective, but, you know, you could flesh that out a bit by thinking mythologically or otherwise, right? So, so that's kind of what I'm trying to say with that, is it provides a depth of meaning, you know, as we learn these various perspectives and apply them to our subject. It enriches them. It enriches our experience of everyday life. Now you're gonna find, and I've been made fun of for this before, that my slides are very austere In fact, these are a white background with black and white pictures, every single one of my slides, except for the title and the end. So hopefully you're mesmerized by the sound of my voice and the subject matter and things like that, because you're not going to be wowed with all kinds of videos and super nifty charts and things like that. These are just black and white pictures on a white background. But anyway, and that's by design. I just like it like that. I like austerity. So, last thing about that is, you know, I use the Western esoteric tradition as my interpretive perspective, because Freemasonry and the work therein, you know, our ritual, our symbolism, and our allegory, etc., is particularly suited to be interpreted from that perspective. And here's some proof. Why else would it attract people like Albert Pike, Arthur Edward Waite, Wilmshurst, Mackey, occultists like Yarker and Westcott and Mathers and Paul Foster Case and you know, even George Oliver? You know, why else would it attract these people unless there was something there for them to grab onto? So now we're finally into the presentation proper, which is where we begin with the lecture, which begins with the operative and speculative denominations of Freemasonry, right? And now what I'm going to do as we go through these, obviously it's almost 500-page book, right? I'm not going to be able to, you know, break the whole thing down. It's not fair for you know, we'd be here for hours. I can't possibly tell you what I'd like or what I told you in the book, but I can give you what I've tried to do was isolate just a couple of things per chapter that will hopefully, you know, a couple of things that I liked along the way. So think of this as a little tour of the book. So here's some operative Masons, right? You ever notice, okay, we talk about astrology and astronomy and the difference between them. We talk about alchemy and chemistry and the difference between those. Why don't we talk about operative and speculative Freemasonry in the same breath, sort of? Because you know what the distinction is? It is Hermeticism. Hermeticism is exactly the distinction between astrology and astronomy, and between alchemy and chemistry, and between operative and speculative Masonry. And here's why. Because both the astrologer and the astronomer measure and calculate and chronicle the movement of celestial bodies as they transit across the ecliptic. They both do that mathematically, geometrically, and otherwise, right? But the astrologer is differentiated hermetically because he believes that these movements and cycles and epicycles have an effect on the astrologer. They have an effect on the microcosm. These macrocosmic movements affect the microcosm. Same as in alchemy and chemistry. They both sort of measure the transformation of elements, you might say, or the transformation of substances and their interactions and things like that. Both alchemy and chemistry do that. Alchemy, however, is hermetically differentiated from chemistry in that the alchemist believes that these operations that happen in the alembic or the retort or the crucible, etc., are concurrently happening inside of the alchemist, and that's Hermeticism. Now, with operative and speculative Masonry, both of which use the tools, the vernacular of temple building, etc., you know, the narrative of King Solomon's temple, etc., and these sorts of concerns, except the speculative Freemason is hermetically differentiated from the operative stonemason in that he believes that the application of these, say, working tools affect him as a man, right? And he further believes that there are hermetic scales of the temple. The temple is not just the terrestrial church that he builds, the cathedral that he builds in the material world, he's also creating that house not made with hands. He's creating an astral temple. He is creating a cosmic temple. He is creating the temple on several hermetic scales, right? So that's why speculative Freemasonry is hermetic. That's why alchemy and astrology are hermetic. So I really get into that there. Let's talk about the Dionysian artificers. They were brought up a lot by people like DaCosta and Mackey, right? Kind of a favorite subject. Now, the Dionysian artificers came from Phoenicia, and they come from the they were theater builders, right? All through the Hellenistic and even into the Roman Empire, right? They were theater builders, and they have such a history with that because of the rites or the mysteries of Dionysus, right? Which precede tragedy. They actually precede the theater. So the theater comes from the mystery tradition, in that these passion plays essentially were acted out, right, in order to communicate secrets that were otherwise ineffable or incommunicable. And look at the word tragedy. It comes from tragos, which is a kind of a male goat, a he-goat, and ode, like ode to a songbird or whatever. Ode just means like a song. So tragos ode. A tragedy is a goat song, and it is a goat song because they were initially hymns to Pan, the sort of centaur, right? And the Dionysian artificers carried these mysteries, according to DaCosta and Mackey, to Jerusalem, where they built the first temple. They were hired, they came across with the Tyrian workmen, and Mackey posits that they communicated their mysteries to the Jews who were working beside them on King Solomon's temple. And after the Tyrian workmen went home, the Dionysian artificers went home, the Jews held on to their mysteries, but instead of, they sort of Judaicized them. They rinsed them of their pagan character, and both DaCosta and Mackey suppose that that's why we get a certain tragedy in the third degree of Masonry. I'm not sure if everybody here is a Master Mason, but know that our tragedy, our goat song in the third degree, according to Mackey and DaCosta, may have had some sort of roots, not a linear progression, because we all know Noahide Masonry sort of intercepts there for a while, but that the general theme could have been something. Who knows? I wasn't there. Nobody was there, so we don't know how that transpired. But that did follow into the guilds. So the medieval cathedral builders guilds, right? The cathedral builders. The church was in the habit of giving out a certain biblical narrative to each of the guilds. So the bakers got the feeding of the 5,000, because they had to bake loaves of bread and things like that. The carpenters got the building of Noah's Ark, etc. And the cathedral builders, though it doesn't say this anywhere, but I kind of build up this hypothesis in the book. Why wouldn't the cathedral builders have been given the building of King Solomon's temple as their mystery play to perform, So I just thought that was interesting, and I explore that a little bit. Again, and when I go on these sort of explorational or, when I go on these excursions, I let you know in the book I'm going on them. I cite my sources meticulously, believe me. But when I am getting into these more speculative realms, I let you know that, hey, this is my idea. I'm just putting this forward for us to think about, because I believe that if we don't do that, we never progress in knowledge, right? Unless there's a spirit of the avant-garde in our research, you know, it's kind of just, it's not a living tradition anymore, right? So then we truly get the speculative denomination of Freemasonry demonstrably and sort of in a documented way. We get that presented in the beginning of the 17th century with people like, or the middle of it, with people like Ashmole and Robert Moray, I believe. Now, Ashmole, he was an astrologer. Thomas de Quincey called him a zealous Rosicrucian. And there's something to be said for, oh, and he was a collector of alchemical codices, if not an alchemist himself. He was deeply interested in alchemy. The Theatricum Chemicum Britannicum or something, I'm pretty sure that was the name of his compilation of alchemical codices into one volume. Pardon my Latin. But so Rosicrucianism, alchemy, and astrology are there at the gates of what we know of as speculative Freemasonry. And that's beyond debate. I mean, it's just there, right? Those people, these were their interests. There's also, you might even think about in 1710 and 1760, there were two sort of emergences of Rosicrucianism, reemergences of Rosicrucianism in proximity to Freemasonry with Samuel Richter's Golden Rosenkreuz and Gold und Rosenkreuzer, the Orden des Golden Rosenkreuzer. Hermann Fichtold in 1760 was another one to kind of get us close to this Rosicrucian current again, which continues to this day. You know, there's always been some mingling there. So now we're on to the pillars. First example I find of something that are demonstrably non-load bearing pillars before a temple, which is what the J and B are, non-load bearing pillars before a temple. This is a picture of Luxor, but there are many temples in Egypt that in front of the pylons, there would be two obelisks there. And I get into the whole pillar thing. I get into the orientation of the temple. Like, here's one. Did you know that the Masonic Lodge is exactly the opposite orientation of King Solomon's temple as described in, 1 Kings and Chronicles, I think. It's exactly the opposite. So, in other words, when you were, say if you were knocking on the door of King Solomon's temple, your back would be to the east. So the sun rose to your back, penetrated the front door between the two pillars, and you know, at certain times a year would penetrate into the Sanctum Sanctorum. So whereas the Masonic Lodge, obviously, you know, we look east, you pass through the pillars and you're looking east. Well, this is exactly the opposite of the orientation of King Solomon's Temple. And I say orientation deliberately because the word even conceals the east, right? Orient, the orientation. And you know, I kind of chop that up in the book quite a bit and explore the possibility that this may be a commentary on man's station vis-a-vis God, right? Because if I don't really want to unpack that right here, but there's an interesting reason why that may be the case. So it's something to look into, and it involves the Gnostic heresy in some way. So like we talked about the Rider-Waite deck, you could see that Freemasonry has definitely influenced the tarot because prominent Freemasons have always been involved in every major evolution in the tarot. You know, at every single point in the development of the tarot, a Freemason has been there sort of steering the ship. And I'm saying from Court de Ghibelline all the way through Paul Foster Case. Every single time a Freemason has been there, whenever there's been a substantial evolution in tarot. So they're connected for better or worse, and I think that's inarguable. Anyway, so I get into the pillars some more. Of course, I talk about the story of Lamech, which is an interesting story, and I recount that whole thing from source documents, and from Anderson's Constitutions. It's actually laid out in there as well. I talk about the inundation and the conflagration, inundation by water, conflagration by fire. I definitely get into the lily work, the network, and the pomegranates. Now, here's another thing with Hermeticism, the globes on top. Remember, we talked about the microcosm and the macrocosm, a central theme in Hermeticism. Those cosmic, and in Neoplatonism, and as far as you care to look back in any mystery tradition, right, you'll find that there's a cosmic resonance, there's a sympathy between the microcosm and the macrocosm, and this analogous relationship kind of informs the philosophy. So we find that we have a terrestrial sphere and a celestial sphere at the top of our pillars. God, it's already 5:42. I got so many more chapters. I'm going to try and get through this quicker. So the winding staircase. But that's what I'm saying. That's why it's a 500-page book. You know, there's so much stuff to get into, and so much stuff that we never touch, really. Anyway, so the winding staircase. Did you know that Vitruvius, in his De Architectura, wrote about an odd number of staircases being preferable to an even number, so you alight with the right foot, you know, so to reduce stumbling or falling. The Levites climbed 15 steps to King Solomon's temple. That's in the Songs of Ascent in Psalms, wherein we find that whole sequence with "Behold how good and pleasant it is," etc. To how does it go, to be in unity with our brethren. I get into, because of the number 15, we have 3, 5, and 7. That's the number 15. I minutely pick that apart. Like Osiris, you know, his 15 pieces that were scattered all over the ancient world for his sister wife Isis to find. And Osiris was also called he who stands at the, one of his many epithets was he who stands at the top of the stairs. I get into a lot of dream symbolism of stairs, which I think is extremely interesting. And how, look at stairways in, like, you look at the stairway in the Munsters, for example, or you look at it in, Gone with the Wind, a film you're not going to be able to see anymore, where it stands for opulence, you know. In the Munsters, it stands for depravity, sort of. You know, there's always this symbolic sort of meaning to staircases. Some of them are straight up and down, thus denoting an easy ascent. Others are winding. You know, that, like our winding staircase, which, you know, because of these twists and turns, and we're going to have to stop at each landing and sort of reassess our orientation. So I get into that sort of stuff. And the number 15. I do a lot of numerological symbolism in there whenever we come across 3, 5, 7, 15, etc. The Camilla, this was kind of interesting. I found literally hundreds of sort of unique observations that I know of no precedent for in our literature or occult literature, right? Like this one, that 3, 5, and 7 is actually could be called the middle chamber of the Camilla of Saturn. So what I mean by that is, any way you care to look at this magic square, right, of pretty great antiquity, actually, but definitely showing up in a lot of Arabic grimoires and finding its way into Agrippa's work, probably via the Picatrix, which is an Arabic grimoire. So every way you care to look, this adds up to 15, just like our winding staircase, but the middle chamber of which is 3, 5, and 7. So little things like that end up coming up, just happy little realizations. On the Tree of Life, you find 3, 5, and 7. When you look at Gimel right here, it has a gematria value of 3. Hey has a gematria value of 5. Zayin has a gematria value of 7, right? So I talk about how the high priestess, who sits here, and the emperor and the lovers represent salt, sulfur, and Mercury. Mercury happens to rule Gemini, who is, I'm not going to get into this minutia here, but believe me that this is an interesting find, because 3, 5, and 7 is salt, sulfur, and Mercury. They're right on the tree right there. And they go from the 3 supernal Sephiroth to the location of the great work. These 3 philosophical principles, 3, 5, and 7, salt, sulfur, and Mercury, combine into Tifereth, the location of the great work on the tree in Hermetic Kabbalah. So I thought that was interesting. I've located it elsewhere on the tree. I think it's one of the appendices. I put the tree in there, and that's the other thing. If you're interested in Hermetic Kabbalah, you're going to probably learn that, at least the nuts and bolts of it, and how to apply it theoretically through my book, like I do in my Facebook posts, if you follow those. So the course of 3 steps, we talk about childhood, manhood, and old age as being one of the corresponding meanings behind there, right? And that brought to mind the riddle of the Sphinx. So what walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs in the afternoon, and 3 legs in the evening? The terrible Sphinx asks Oedipus, as he is trying to gain entry into Thebes. If he answers wrongly, he will be thrown off a cliff, or otherwise killed or devoured by this Sphinx. But he answers man, because man crawls on all 4s when he's in childhood. He walks on 2 legs when in manhood, and in old age he walks with a cane, thus having 3 legs. And the Sphinx threw herself off the cliff due to that, and Oedipus was able to gain entry into Thebes and go on with the rest of his tragic story, if you know it. That was a dubious honor for him to be able to pass the Sphinx. He probably would have been better off dying right there, if you know the story. Anyway, so 3, 5, and 7. The course of 3 steps is also attributed to the junior and senior wardens and the worshipful master, along with their working tools. And I, of course, take every opportunity to get into these Cartesian coordinates that are represented by our 3 working tools. And there's such a strange cosmogonical sort of system in the working tools of a fellowcraft. That's what these are. The working tools of a fellowcraft. They represent, one way of looking at them is how they represent the X, Y, and Z axes of 3-dimensional Cartesian space. And you could bring that into Minkowski space if you want a more updated model. You could bring that into how it informs relativity, or you could look backwards and see this in the Sefer Yetzirah of the Kabbalists, the very first sort of, I guess you might say, proto-Kabbalistic document, the Sefer Yetzirah. So I get into all that sort of stuff. The course of 5 steps, I get into the mythological correspondences of each of the orders of architecture, particularly the Doric, the Ionic, and the Corinthian, which, this would be Mars due to its strength. This would be because it's, strength, wisdom, and beauty are those 3, right? They correspond to the junior warden, the senior warden, and the worshipful master, wisdom, right? And the Doric order were used in houses of, military constructions and things like that. They were stout. They didn't have a base, and they were more sturdy, more martial. The Ionic were used in houses of learning, libraries, and academies and things like that. The Corinthian were used in museums of or relating to the muses, right? They were used in houses of beauty and aesthetics and things. So I get into all that stuff. trying to get through a lot faster now. God, I'm really going to have to cut a lot out. There's a lot of good stuff with the five senses. With the module, a module is once around the base of the pillar, and how that dictates the intercolumnation. So if you're into digging deeper into these orders of architecture and how they are applied and how they relate to the entablature, and the various parts like the architrave, the frieze, the cornice, if you have a pediment up there, and bases, and the stoa and things like that, I get into that. So if you've ever wanted to learn more about that, you feel like your knowledge is anemic on the classical orders of architecture, you'll get a lot out of the book. Okay, let's go on to the 7 liberal arts, the course of 7 steps. So this is a lot to bite off. And let me see, it's 5:51.
Hey, Jamie, it's Adam. Don't feel like you need to like rush through this. I mean, I think we'd rather have you go through each one, and if we're happy to set up a part 2. Don't even worry about that. Go until you're comfortable, but yeah, don't feel like you're rushed at all.
Well, I appreciate that, but I really appreciate the Q&A section. So maybe it's partially me being anxious to get to the Q&A, because I feel like that's where, and hopefully people bring stuff, like I just like talking about the work. I'm excited about it, as you could probably tell. It's I've really discovered so much, and a lot of, again, a lot of original observations, which I think is indicative of inspiration, right? In researching these subjects, I've been inspired, when we're talking about the 7 liberal arts, I like to bring up the Tetractys, because like the Tetractys, the 7 liberal arts, particularly the quadrivium, are laid out in a sequence for a reason. So they're laid out just like the point, the top course of the Tetractys is just a point having position but no magnitude, and then it becomes a line, 2 points, and then 3 points on the third course, where you get the first initial superficies or surface, a plane, a 2-dimensional plane. And then you get the course of 4 points, where 4 points allows you to establish the points of a tetrahedron, the simplest of the Platonic solids. So a bunch of things like that end up coming up. I talk about Martianus Capella and his On the Marriage of Mercury and Philology, which is where we see a lot of early codification of the 7 liberal arts and sciences. I talk about grammar as it pertains not only to language, but it pertains to architecture. You can have a grammar of shipbuilding, for example. There's a certain vernacular that goes with it. You of course have a grammar of Freemasonry and of stonemasonry. There's just a certain vernacular, a technical vernacular. There are certain conventions that we use. You notice them in our rituals and in our lectures. The word grammar, and I get deeply into this, is cognate to grimoire. In fact, they're the same word, except a grimoire we've come to associate it with, specifically with books of magic, or ciphers sometimes, or magical alphabets and things. So I go down the rabbit hole getting into Trithemius, and certainly into pretty much the entirety of the grimoire tradition, which goes back a lot further than people think, to the Omenic literature of Mesopotamia on cuneiform tablets, all the way through, the Magus, Francis Barrett, things like that. Even into the modern day, people are still writing grimoires. It's a living tradition, but it's a grammar. It is exactly a grammar, and it qualifies as such. The ars memoria, which is a rhetorical, speaking about rhetoric, it's a rhetorical technique, the art of memory. It's been written about a lot in Masonic circles, but I particularly take it into sort of the arena of Bruno, right? Giordano Bruno and his astral temple, you know, the creation of an astral temple as a memory palace, sort of. And isn't it funny? Here's something I get into deeply there. When we're doing our proficiency, our memorization work as Masons, as I've said before, speculative Masons are hermetic. That's essentially the hermetic distinction, right? In that we believe that these things have an effect in on the microcosm and on various hermetic scales, or else we wouldn't talk about the house not made with hands eternal in the heavens, or the temple in man, or the terrestrial temple. You know, when we do our proficiency, when we learn ritual and we're through our catechism, we have to recite this again, you know, to prove proficiency. We are solidifying the temple inside of our sort of we are building our inner temple. That's why memorization is so important and such a hermetic device. Everybody has known about this. To Giordano Bruno and previous, you know, to him, that when you create that structure in your mind, through memorization and through associating movements, like I know the stewards are going to retire to the preparation room at this point, and I see this stuff happening, right? You know, as you go through the ritual in your memorization work, you move the officers around, you orient yourself in the temple, you're creating this astral temple. You're creating the temple inside of you and at the various hermetic scales. So I think that's super important, and I deeply get into that subject. There's those alphabets on the right there. That's these are Cipher alphabets, and on the right here, that's Giordano Bruno's. That's Francis Yates' recreation of Giordano Bruno's memory wheel, which was based on, you'll notice this goes around 36 times. So it's based on the decans of the zodiac. And if you know me at all personally or on Facebook, you know that I'm deeply into astrology. So I take any chance I get to kind of go there. The Tetractys, like we talked about, the point, the line, the superficies, the tetrahedron. Here's an illustration of that. I talk about number symbolism, numerology, gematria, things like that, you know, as like a Abraxas or a Brassix, more accurately, totaling to 365 in Greek isopsophy, which is like Greek gematria, essentially. It's and using forms of arithmancy, which is number magic, essentially. So that's a very ancient practice. So ancient that it's pre-Socratic. It goes back to Pythagoras. Pythagoras was very mystical about his use of numbers, very symbolical and very magical about it. So, and you know, the point within a circle, this is Thales' theorem, how you will always form a right angle wherever you move point B along the perimeter of this circle, and the esoteric meanings of that, as well as the superficial meanings of that, and the Pythagorean theorem here. So, or the 3-4-5 triangle. I get into ritualized sound. I get into art as frozen music, architecture as frozen music, which was brought up by Goethe. And von Schelling and people like that, that if you look at a cathedral, for example, there are musical relationships, musically intervallic relationships, octaves and fifths and thirds, and it is essentially like looking at a musical piece. And if you've ever like heard liturgical organ music in a cathedral, it is a moving experience. I encourage you to do that. When we lived in Los Angeles, we lived by the Methodist church downtown, had the largest operational church pipe organ in the world currently. It was so loud, it would literally like rattle your teeth. You could feel it in your chest. You know, Dr. Christoph Bull was the house organist there. Just amazing. Or if you live in Phoenix here, a brother of ours, he's also a brother, he's Scottish brother from Kilwinning, but he lives in Phoenix now, and he's the grand organist of Arizona. He plays down at the Basilica downtown, an amazing organist. Check out some organ music, liturgical organ music in a cathedral. If you ever want to do something for your education program at your lodge, and let's say you want to focus on the liberal arts, which I encourage you to do, that should be the bulk of our education program. You know, that's my opinion, because that's our curriculum. Anyway, if you're ever focusing on music, you want to make an education program on music, go check out some liturgical organ music on a Sunday. It'll blow your mind. You know, these places are created for that music. The organ is literally built into these places, you know, and it's an insane experience. So I get into how Pythagoras with his monochord and various pitch pipes and things was able to, you know, glasses of water, was able to find these intervallic relationships and these ratios, right? And he related them to the Tetractys, actually. And they permeate his, just as mystical number systems, arithmancy, and likewise permeate his theological teachings, so too does the harmony of the spheres, which is how he even viewed the planets as being intervallically related. I talk about 3, 7, and 12. They total to 22, which is a Kabbalistically significant number, because there's 3 notes in a triad, C, E, and G in the key of C. There's 7 notes in the diatonic scale, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. So, or do would be right here. But there's 7 notes before they repeat at the octave. And then the chromatic scale, which I'm not going to sing for you, which is every note in Western music. So there's 3, 7, and 12. These are also very astrologically significant numbers. They're significant numbers in terms of the mother letters, the double letters, and the simple letters. They're significant in terms of tarot. There's, of course, significant in terms of music. There's so much occult significance behind music that it's frankly scary, right? There's just so much going on there. So here's one of my big theses, let's say, that I found out of several. I'd say that while there are 100 unprecedented ideas that I bring for your consideration, there are probably 5 of them that are game-changing, like mind-blower situations, like this one, for example. I get into the Kepler's Mysterium Cosmographicum, and where he, using the Platonic solids, deposited those in between the Neoplatonic planetary spheres. I know that sounds heavy, but if you read the book, I make this make sense, right? And he said that their relationship was based on the Platonic solids fitting inside of a sphere, touching on each point, right? And that's how he delineated the planets. Well, I was just, because it's something I want to do, I was putting that on the tree, because the tree of life also has that same Neoplatonic spherical, the Neoplatonic planetary order, the Chaldean order of planets, right? With the moon, Mercury, Venus, the sun, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, etc. The Earth down here. It's a geocentric model, but there's the crux of the issue. So as I was working on that, I found, okay, I was putting the Platonic solids on the paths that would connect these Sephiroth, just like these spheres have the Platonic solids between them. And I noticed that as I was going from Venus to the sun, I found that, that's actually where the Earth is, right? So then it dawned on me, oh my God, we're using we're using a geocentric Kabbalah. Our tree of life is geocentric, you know. So then I start to work up. I didn't get too deeply into it, but I thought it was so. It blew my mind when I found this, right? So I swapped Malkuth with Tifereth to make a heliocentric tree, which maybe, you know, that could turn into something. And I'm going to develop that further, maybe in a standalone work. But I felt like that was worth sharing. Oh, we're already at the wages, so we're right near the end. What time is it? It's 6:06. You know, back with the music thing, I get into Orpheus and the myth of Orpheus with his lyre and how crucial that was to certain mystery traditions. Well, of course, the Orphic rites, you know, the Orphic hymns and things. I get into how Marsilio Ficino really worked on some of these Orphic ideas as he was translating Orphic literature. I get into the Musica Universalis. I get into the harmony of the spheres. Another big idea was lunar occultation, which I'm not going to break off right now, but it is something that I found something very striking. A very significant, that's one of the big 5 gigantic theses that I found and developed in this work. There's like 5 huge ideas and probably 100 interesting ones for your consideration. Heliocentric tree of life, astrology, mythology, and magic. On to the wages. So what I do, remember we were talking about salt, sulfur, and mercury. We were talking about 3, 5, and 7, because this is Gimel, 3. That's the gematria. That's the Hebrew letter and its gematria value. This is He, 5, and this is Zayin, or 7. And salt, a cube of salt, she is sort of is the sort of Stella Maris, right? There's lunar symbolism, there's profundity, there is you know, here again the moon and the tides and how they relate, you know, because due to the salt content, you know, gravitational pull in salt water, etc. Her sitting on a white cubical stone. Salt is has a cubical atomic formation, essentially. Sulfur for the emperor because he is Aries. You see the rams right here. Mars rules Aries. It's very fiery, you know, very sulfuric. And then Mercury for the number 7, or Zayin, or the lovers, because it represents Gemini, and Gemini is ruled by Mercury. So there is the idea of the universal solvent, right? This thesis, antithesis, synthesis that is a mercurial modality that happens. So we have salt, sulfur, and mercury, 3, 5, 7 right here. I don't recall anybody finding that before, so that's kind of one of the biggies, and I worked that out. Salt, sulfur, and mercury. So what I do, and this is interesting, in the chapter on the wages, which are corn, wine, and oil, I work up corn, wine, and oil as salt, sulfur, and mercury. You know, corn, how like corned beef is salt cured beef. When you corn something, you salt it. Wine is mercurial because it is the spirits, the alcohol. Corn, wine, and oil is sulfuric because the essential oils of a plant, according to Paracelsus, are the sulfur of the plant. So right there you have salt, sulfur, and mercury in corn, wine, and oil. It's demonstrable. I'm not the first one to get there, by the way. Other people have noted this, though rarely. You may have never seen that before. I've only seen it in a couple of places. But then I go on to do I give directions of how you, with common kitchen stuff and whatever plant matter you can find even in your front yard can do a spagyric alchemical operation that will take you 40 days. 40 days, and you can refine the salt, sulfur, and mercury. You could separate or solvate and recombine, or coagula. Solve et coagula. You can separate and recombine the salt, sulfur, and mercury of plant matter in a spagyric alchemical operation in the vegetable kingdom with no weird, nothing that you don't already have in your house. And you do this according to astrological principles. I lay the whole operation out. And remember how we said about alchemy and chemistry. This isn't merely chemistry. This is alchemy, because when you do an alchemical operation, you are simultaneously reaping the benefits of that operation in you, the alchemist, the operator. So it behooves us to do even the most simple alchemical operations. Yeah, you can talk about spiritual alchemy, and you can talk about inner alchemy, and yeah, man, I'm getting my thing together and stuff. But unless you're like, unless you actually do the external operations, even if they're very humble, simple spagyric operations, unless you're doing these operations, you can't be said to be reaping the benefit of them. And those are the wages. Those are corn, wine, and oil. We're essentially told to do that, right? So I definitely lay out a practicum in the wages. Lastly, this is the last slide. You've arrived at the middle chamber of King Solomon's temple. And you're given the G lecture, right? So I minutely go through that, and this is so much to bite off right now, because I get into the philosophy of a man named Immanuel Kant, who has had so much influence on my thinking, despite the fact that he's an Enlightenment era philosopher. But that would have been concurrent with the what we know of as speculative masonry, though I don't think he was a Mason. He was a deep thinker, and there is so much about the G and so much about the senses on the course of 5 steps on this staircase, that I end up repeatedly bringing up the work of Immanuel Kant, particularly his critique of pure reason, which is a tremendous work. So I kind of get your feet wet with Immanuel Kant before closing the book out with a summary. But I encourage you to look into this man's work. But try mine first, because it'll set him up. You know, very. They in fact said Immanuel Kant ruined philosophy. So for everybody else. And that's almost kind of true. I'm not going to give away how, but it was definitely a paradigm shift with his work. So, the end. Thanks for hanging out. And I hope that I was able to give you a brief sort of tour through my new work, which is, now I gotta say, again, I'm bringing up my humility here that Adam brought up at the beginning of this. Putting my humility aside for a second, I will say that every single fellowcraft in the world needs to have this book. I don't know of another book that does this, right? Name another book that minutely goes through the 7 liberal arts and sciences in their Masonic context. You know, there's a huge vacuum in our literature, and I was like, "Bing, I'm going to write a book and put it right there." You know, so I feel like I did that, and I feel like nobody's going to be offended by it. And in terms of, if you know my brand, if you know what I'm about Western esotericism. Like I said, I don't make any bones about that. That's my critical perspective. Might not be for you, but if you're interested in that sort of stuff, then you're going to find a ton to like in Approaching the Middle Chamber, the 7 liberal arts in Freemasonry, and the Western esoteric tradition, available now on the Laudable Pursuit website. That's the publisher. They put out my last book. They put out P.D. Newman's Alchemically Stoned. So again, I want to thank the guys at Benjamin B. French Lodge in DC. I love DC. Can't wait to get out and see the guys at Singleton again, and BBF, and thanks Joe. Thanks Refracted Light. My deepest condolences to worshipful brother Pedro, and thanks Adam. I'm going to hand it back over to you, and Q&A, I hope.
Yeah, I hope so too. Thank you so much. Awesome. Absolutely wonderful. Wouldn't have expected anything less. Just an absolute wealth of knowledge. And like I said at the outset, an eidetic memory for mythos and things of that nature. And I agree. I ordered the book, and but I did see that Piers Vaughn had a similar comment as to what you just said, that it just fills a gap, that nobody has had this kind of level of analysis of the Middle Chamber lecture. So yeah, with that, maybe I'll start, or Joe, maybe I'll punt to you because I know you're better at doing the QA portion. So do you want to start with some people on the Zoom and then go to your Facebook? How do you want to do it?
Yeah, we can. There was I'm scrolling through Facebook right now. I did want to run that plug real quick, and then we can unleash the world upon Jaime Lamb. So let me before we lose everyone's attention. So Worshipful Pedro and the brothers at BBF are a big part of Refracted Light. Can you guys see my screen? Okay. So wanted me to plug Refracted Light real quick for those that are not familiar with it. So if you didn't come to this presentation by way of Refracted Light, we're going to tell you a little bit what it is and how you can go learn more. So Refracted Light is it brings you wonderful presentations like Jaime Lamb's Approaching the Middle Chamber. So what it is was an effort by a bunch of different Masons across the country to bring Masonic education to the masses in light of the the current pandemic that we had. So we started it in about March of 2020. It has absolutely skyrocketed in terms of popularity and the types of presentations that we do. So it is not run by any single person or individual. There is a whole plethora of us that actually work on content to bring live Masonic education, again, to the masses. So we're not sponsored, endorsed, or funded by any grand jurisdiction. It's just Masons who really love education, who miss going to lodge or even miss getting education when they go to lodge, and wanted to bring it to you all. So out of the throes of the coronavirus pandemic and quarantine, a whole bunch of people popped up out of the woodwork to share with us. So some of the rules that we have at Refracted Light, we're all on the level. This isn't one of those Facebook groups where people complain and moan and argue about things. Everybody is here for sharing light, and that is its sole purpose. Another rule we have is checking your ego at the door. We don't care about your ranks, your titles. We don't care how many lapel pins you have or how many sashes you wear. We do not care. You are here for Masonic education only. And Jaime Lamb has been an absolutely instrumental part of that. We're not into, again, hate speech and bullying. That's pretty self-explanatory. No spam. So you will not find in this Facebook group, you will not find advertisements to buy things all the time. If it's not related to Masonic education, it's not going on the wall on our Facebook group. And then the last thing is we don't discuss secrets. So you really can't tile the open internet. You really can't tile Facebook very well. So this group is open to everyone, non-Masons, other esoteric orders, women, men, lizard people. So whatever category you fall into, you are welcome here. But we just ask that you be respectful and seek to learn more about Freemasonry and things like that. So last couple of things I'll say is there's pretty much something to do every night of the week, and I don't see that stopping as these quarantine restrictions get lifted or re-added or what have you. So people from all over the country and even around the world are adding things. So some of the folks that help us do that are the Masonic Roundtable. They've absolutely helped. North Carolina Masonic Research Society, big part of Refracted Light. The Joint Masonic Education Series, so that's guys out of Missouri and Massachusetts. Mid-Atlantic Esotericon, which I'm a part of. The Masonic Legacy Society. If you don't know what that is, go to Google right after this talk and go Google that. It is an awesome website. Castle Island Virtual Lodge, one of the first virtual lodges in the world. They've actually helped us out quite a bit with some education. Different lodges of instruction in Massachusetts. DC Lodge 643 in Ohio. They put on some great presentations. Delaware River Lodge and Nathan Tweedy, they've done some awesome stuff. Esoteric Sundays group, that is a fabulous group. If you're into esoterics, reach out to Jeremy, who's on here. Lexington Lodge in Kentucky, Brother Brad, he's put some awesome presentations on our site. The Blue Lounge Social Club out of Australia, they've done some phenomenal stuff. It's at like 4 a.m. Eastern time, so if you want to wake up and see something cool, give it a look. The Unknown Philosophers group, they're on the West Coast. I think they're in Arizona with Jaime. Really awesome bunch of guys that put on amazing presentations. BBF number 15 out of DC, the premier esoteric lodge in the District of Columbia. And finally, Jaime Paul Lamb. He's been a ginormous part of Refracted Light success and always is available to teach and to talk and to welcome folks in his open arms. So again, if you're not familiar with Refracted Light, we're on Facebook at that website. We also have a YouTube page now, so any videos that you see, including this one, once we're done going live, we stick it on our YouTube page so you can show it at your lodge, you can show it to your friends at home, you can listen to it in the car. So you can take this out of Facebook world and give it to other people and bring them to share in the light. And that was really all I had, Brother Adam.
Yeah, thank you. All right. Yeah. And I'll say it again before we get to Jamie's questions. Just, thank you, Joe. You're doing the yeoman's work and you've been instrumental during this COVID crisis. And so thank you so much for all you've been doing. So let's start with, let's see, can we, I want to make sure I get the grid view. What's the best way of doing this? Maybe do you guys all know how to use hands up, or you can just unmute yourself?
Just unmute yourself. I don't unmute 50 people. Just unmute yourself, and I'll put it in gallery view and ask away.
All right, sounds good.
Jamie, I'll be first. When is Laudable Pursuit going to ship the books? Just out of curiosity.
If you ordered it the other day when it was released on the 24th, he put in, I was texting with him, he put in that order the very next day. So, I mean, they should have probably shipped, or well, there's probably, I'd give them a few days for manufacturing as well. So this is the long form of, I'm not exactly sure how long that's going to take, but not inordinately long. I mean, and I do know that first day that I think he took 120 orders that first day, which I felt pretty good about. That definitely exceeded Myth, Magic, and Masonry opening, So that was pretty cool. So I haven't gotten mine yet. So let's say that I've got my proof copy. I've got one copy of my book, so I'm going to be getting a box. Now, here's the other thing I didn't want to announce too loudly, but if you do want a signed copy, you could always email me, and I'm going to put my email right now in the chat. You could email me, and I'll be getting a box within the next couple of days here. Email me, and I'm starting to compile a list. Oh shit! I'm starting to compile a list of people who want the a signed copy. So there's my email in the thing.
All right, Jeremy, you're up. Go ahead, Jer.
Okay, great. Thanks, brother Jamie. Awesome presentation as usual.
Thank you.
So, just a couple questions, maybe some areas where I'd like to just hear more of your thoughts on. I've always been thinking about this corn oil wine thing, and I like how you connected it to salt, sulfur, and mercury. Um, I wanted to hear more why these would be considered the wages of a Mason. Why would this be seen as our payment? Why would salt, sulfur, and mercury be our wages?
Okay, so they were operative wages, as you know, so you could cure meats with the salt, right? In the ancient world, you can cure meats. The oil for anointing, cooking, many other reasons that we use oil, right?
For our
Uh,
beards?
for our beards or our super cool
There you go.
mustaches.
There you go.
And that everybody seems to be scared to. All you guys are chicken to rock one of these. You hide behind your beards.
There can be only one, Jamie.
Yeah, when you run one of these, women seem to hold their purses much closer. They don't let their kids around you. It's a pretty big flex. Anyway, salt, sulfur, and mercury, the wine of pleasure and enjoyment, right? So that's the operative end of it. The speculative end of it, if you translate that into the three philosophical principles, which are salt, corned beef, etc., salt, sulfur, and mercury. Why these are the wages? One way of putting that is because when you do a spagyric alchemical operation, and I've done many over the years, some of them more complex than others. It's kind of my wheelhouse. I don't call myself an alchemist, but I've absorbed enough of, I guess I kind of am, because I've absorbed enough of Paracelsian spagyric alchemy. That is alchemy in the kingdom vegetabilis, right? So it's only vegetable kingdom alchemy. I've made dimethyltryptamine out of acacia root bark before.
With Brother Newman?
Not with him
Right.
before I actually met him, but based on his early papers. So that's an interesting story.
Yeah.
So just to quickly answer your question, then I'll quickly tell that story, is when you do a spagyric operation, as opposed to merely reading about it in Bartlett or someplace like that, or Waite's commentary on Paracelsus, etc., when you do the operation, you reap the benefits of it. And when you reap the benefits, you gain the wages of that operation, which is the hermetic interaction between the microcosm and the macrocosm. In that, you are transformed. You are the three elements of you, let's say, psyche, pneuma, and soma, which correspond to salt, sulfur, and mercury, as does the anima, corpus, and espiritus, right, in Latin. So this tripartite nature of man, right, the pneuma, the psyche, and the soma, the mind, body, and spirit, we might say in common vernacular today, when you separate, isolate, purify or sublimate, and then recombine those, solve et coagula, right? This operation helps us, this operation simultaneously occurs in the body, mind, and spirit of the alchemist. So our wages are paid upon the completion of the work. And that is the only way we get those wages. So that's how we get those wages. Now back to the dimethyltryptamine real quick.
Yeah.
Did that make sense?
Yeah, it did make sense. I mean, in a way, I see it as these are the ingredients that we need to transform ourselves, or we need to work with these. I mean, that's kind of how I understood it. Is the salt, sulfur, and mercury are the fundamental ingredients of transformation.
Yeah.
And what a great thing to pay somebody, right? So especially somebody who's seeking self-transformation.
Perhaps the most valuable payment one could receive,
Exactly.
right?
Yeah.
So regarding dimethyltryptamine and the acacia, I procured Acacia confusa root bark from a source, Acacia confusa, the subterranean root bark that cleaves from the bone of the roots, if you will. I procured that along with the Paganum harmala as a monoacidase oxide inhibitor. I think it's called MAOI, right? Which
Yeah.
and did an alchemical operation which took about 2 weeks, and created a red elixir from that. Drank it, tripped my face off like I have never done in my life, went to a completely another realm, right? And this is based on, I'm speaking to the efficacy of Newman's work at this point, because, and I'm not saying go out and do drugs. Of course, I'm not saying that, because this isn't, I don't have a Nancy Reagan idea about doing drugs. You know, I don't have that
Right.
sort of like puritanical war on drugs, just say no idea.
Right.
I believe that if you're a responsible adult and you use it as a sacrament, that is different than shooting up in a McDonald's bathroom. You know,
Oh,
I
yeah.
just
I
see a
mean,
massive.
Even when I talk to PD Newman, I call them medicines because these are plants and they've been used in spiritual traditions. But he corrected me and said it's better even to say sacrament.
I say sacrament
Yeah.
because Newman taught me that, and he's the authority on that.
Yeah.
So, yeah, and I got that from before I met him and before he wrote the book. He had a couple of papers out that I was fortunate enough to come into contact with, and before I even met him, I had made the
Oh, okay. Wow.
yeah,
Wow.
and that's how I got in touch with him.
Mm.
And he did the foreword of my first book, and we've been just best pals ever since. So.
Awesome story. Thanks, brother. Appreciate it.
So, Brother Jamie, I got a question on Facebook from Brother Ben Wallace. He says, wonderful job, Jamie. Thank you for your scholarship. I'm fascinated by your theory on the geocentric model of the tree. Are you saying that it could have been originally modeled that way due to the fact that that is the way the creators of the concept of the tree viewed their universe at the time? Or do you suggest that the tree is just misunderstood by generally being solar centric? Can you elaborate?
Okay, so I found it by accident. I stumbled across that, like I said, when I was attributing the Platonic solids to the paths that connect those Sephiroth, according to Kepler's Mysterium Cosmographicum. So as I was putting that together, I found that I was about to go from Netzach to Tifereth, and I was like, wait a second. This goes from Netzach to Haaretz, Haaretz, the earth, right? This goes to Malkuth next. And I'm like, wow, and then it clicked. And at first there was a moment where I was just like, huh? And then I was like, wait a second, we're using a geocentric Kabbalah. Why not use a heliocentric Kabbalah? You know? And then I scoured, I was like, somebody has got to have found this, right? So then I looked all over the internet, and you tell me if you find it, because I have not found it. I have not found a heliocentric Kabbalah that transposes Malkuth and Tifereth. And then, because I know what your next thing is going to be, what about the moon, which is actually an epicycle? What about Yesod, which is actually an epicycle off of the earth? Well, if you just have one path going down to Yesod, I've worked this out elsewhere, and I'm going to probably write a full piece on it. But here's the thing. If you don't find it anyplace else, and I don't think you're going to be able to, but if you do, let me know, please. If you don't find it anyplace else, my next book will likely expand on this, or at least I'll write a lengthy paper on it. And what was I going to say? Oh, yeah. At least I put enough of it in this book to get everybody's head around it, and to have it as a placeholder that, frankly, I'm sticking my flag there saying, hey, this is kind of, this is one of the things I found.
Right on. He replied with a smiley face, so I'm guessing he liked that. And then we had one more question from Facebook. Going back to the circular cipher slide. Michael Pritchard asked, why are the two outer rings the same?
I didn't get too much into his model per se, only that he had a model. So I didn't decipher, because that's via Francis Yates, Dame Yates, who wrote a lot about Bruno and the art of memory. So while I did touch on, yes, that was Yates's recreation of his model, I did not get into the application or origin of the concentric rings of his model. But I'm sure upon contemplation of that, and I reproduce it in the book, on contemplation of that, you'll probably, it's probably demonstrable. And I would recommend reading Yates's work on Bruno, maybe starting with Bruno and the Giordano Bruno and the Hermetic Tradition, which is a fantastic book if you want to get into the Florentine Academy, Ficino, Pico della Mirandola, and people like that up to Bruno. So, sorry.
And then one more very open-ended question from Adam Stoddard.
What is God?
Yeah, it was pretty close. What are your thoughts on the moon? Period.
So if somebody says the moon, I think Yesod instantly comes to mind. Hecate comes to mind. Selene comes to mind. The High Priestess card comes to mind. So there's the letter Gimel comes to mind. The number 3 comes to mind because of that. There's a flood. Oh, you know what? This is actually a pretty good question, because remember how we were talking about in the beginning, when you develop these theoretical perspectives, these critical theories, right? These theoretical perspectives from which you survey something, right? When things enter into your life, whether it's a license plate, whether it's something as inconsequential as a hamburger or a comment, there's the moon, there are so many vantage points that we develop in Western esotericism. You've got, what does the moon mean in alchemy? It has very specific few meanings, right? Luna philosophorum, there's several, it's the salt as well. When you think of the moon in astrology, now that's something, I'm not even going to go there because I could do another presentation on that. When you think of the moon in mythology, numerous, Hathor, Bat before her, B-A-T. There are so many, Thoth, did you know that Thoth was a lunar, the ibis? In his ibis form, before he became associated with Mercury, he was associated with the moon. He was a lunar deity. So when you develop this perspective, which my book will help you do, when somebody says the moon, you're not merely thinking, oh, the white thing, or you know what I mean? That white light or whatever, that white light, man. You're thinking all this other stuff.
Awesome. Anything else, Joe, on Facebook?
No, I think that's it.
All right, we're back. We're back in the room then. So Zoom room, it's all you guys. Who wants to ask a question? Yeah, go ahead, Tim. I see you have a question. Go ahead. Unmute yourself.
It's Tim.
Yep.
Hey, Tim. Where's your face?
I don't know. Can you see it now?
No, where's that beard of yours?
Yeah, quit lurking in the shadows, Tim.
You can't be a creep here. We kick creeps out.
I'm trying.
Put your pants on, Tim, first, though.
Oh, I can't get the camera. Damn it.
All right, forget about it. It's fine.
My fingers.
What's going on?
So you're probably gonna not like this question, but because you said you weren't gonna get into it during your presentation, but your heliocentric tree of life. Could you talk a little bit more about your ideas on that, and kind of maybe just briefly talk about some of the differences between that and what we have now?
I just did that one. Somebody just asked that question, and I just went over the entire thing.
So
like
Tim,
5 minutes ago.
The bottom,
5 minutes.
yeah, the bottom line is the tree is a toric field, and Malkuth is in the center.
Yeah, no, I heard the presentation. I was just
No, not in the presentation. Somebody asked that question in the Q&A, but I'll tell you just real quick. Because of Kepler's Mysterium Cosmographicum and the Neoplatonic or the Platonic solids in between the spheres, I found that as I was going from Netzach to Tifereth, that it actually was going. Kepler's model was heliocentric and was going to the Earth from Venus,
Yeah.
as is the order of our planets in real life, right? And I found that the tree, which I was using as a theoretical perspective to investigate that, and the paths thereupon, right? I found that the tree didn't line up like that. The tree is geocentric. So I had to, I kind of played with that idea in a very fruitful way. I didn't completely develop it, but it's massively different from, it's workable though. It still works. I mean, it's a heliocentric Kabbalah that I think could be a biggie, you know? And I worked up enough of it in this book without making the whole book about it. I worked up enough of it in this book to, again, just sort of plant my flag there and say, I'm going to get back to this later. But it's a potentially huge idea.
Yeah, no, I was tracking all that. I guess what I was getting at would be like some of the subsets. I guess the tables and everything, correspondences would kind of change and have to be realigned. And
yeah. So some of the minutia I didn't get into because, again, I didn't want to make the book about that. And it was something that I could make a whole next book about if I wanted to. So I wanted to leave some meat on the bone there and get back to it later. But I could talk to you about it.
okay, yeah, I'll email you about it.
All right, cool.
All right, thanks.
Yeah.
And next, I'm going to come up with an Ein Sof-centric tree. So that's going to be really creative.
There you go.
Yeah. And any who else in the Zoom chat? Anybody else want to stump the expert?
We got Patrick. You had a question?
Patrick.
So, sorry, I was on mute. Yeah, you mentioned call relationship there, and I was curious where you first bumped into that concept, and if there are any key takeaways you could share with us, and then any recommended reading on the topic.
Wait, you were robotic for a second, and I missed the beginning of that. What was the?
You kind of briefly mentioned a relationship between music and occultism.
He said the relationship between music and occultism.
Oh, I see. Yeah. So basically that was about the first stop on that had to do with 3, 5, and 7. So I've been a musician my whole life, and played a lot of jazz, a lot of improvisational music. I can read, I can write music and things, and the triad, a major triad or even a minor triad, 1, 3, 5. It's 3 notes create this first, because 2 notes is just an interval. That's an intervallic relationship. 3 notes is where you get harmony proper because it belongs to a certain family, major, minor, or dominant. So 3 notes is a triad, 1, 3, 5, or 1 flat 3, 5, you might say. 7 notes is the diatonic scale or a heptatonic scale. So that 7-note scale is the scale upon which all Western music theory is based, right? So when we talk about a 1, 3, 5 chord, for example, we're talking about the intervals of that diatonic or heptatonic 7-note scale. 12, the dodecatonic, I guess, chromatic scale is all 12 notes in Western music. So on a staff, those are the only 12 notes there. Everything else, microtonal stuff and sort of trills or whatever little effects, are notated differently. So there are 3 notes in a triad, 7 notes in a diatonic scale, 12 notes in a chromatic scale, which comprise the totality, the tonal palette of Western music theory. These have to do with occultism in that at many scales, at many different vantage points. First, let's just talk about the purely numerological, right? 3 with salt, sulfur, and mercury, and this triune nature of man, and how that permeates occult traditions from the Trinity to, the Osiris, Isis, and Horus, all the way through. I mean, you can find that tripartite configuration, the pneuma, the psyche, and the soma, et cetera, et cetera. 7, because this is a planetary model. And one of the things I get into about these 7 visible planets of the ancients, look at what temple is it in, it's in Iran now, but there's a temple of the 7 spheres, they call it. I think it's Borsippa. If not Borsippa, it's the other one. Ben Nurabi, maybe. I forget the name of it, but I talk about it in the book. There's another temple, the Temple of 7 Spheres. So since time immemorial, I'm talking 6,000 years ago, Mesopotamian astrologers or astronomers, they were identical at the time, had differentiated these 7 moving stars, these 7 wandering stars. So 7 permeates occultism. It's just as much as astrology permeates magic. I mean, astrology is the chassis upon which magical operations run in a lot of, particularly in the grimoire sense. Now, regarding 12, that's of course zodiacal. So we just looked at those from the numerological and the sort of Kabbalistic, or the sort of astrological perspective. If you look from the Kabbalistic perspective, you find 3 mother letters, you find 7 double letters, and you find the 12 simple letters or single letters. And these have correspondences per, like, let's say the Cipher manuscript that became the work of the Golden Dawn, which is what we base a lot of our when we think of modern Western magical practices, modern Western Hermeticism, and orders like Builders of the Adytum and GD and these other orders, we're thinking about a very specific curriculum and a very specific set of correspondences. And the first appearance of those correspondences happen in a certain Cipher manuscript that I'm not going to, but you should get a book called The Complete Cipher Manuscript of the Golden Dawn. Translated by Darcy Kuntz, who I think is on this, maybe on this group right now. But he did the translation. It's brilliant, and I encourage you to get that. Golden Dawn Research Trust, and those 3 numbers and those correlations permeate Western occultism. They also permeate it in terms of ratio, proportion, harmony, things like that I could literally spend another hour talking about right now.
And
Thanks for addressing that.
Yeah, and as far as supplemental reading, when you come over, I want to say it's the Sacred Geometry book by Skinner that gets really deep into the sacred geometry and music nexus. And I know Paul Foster Case's book on tarot does as well. It talks about how the major arcana align with the different notes of the musical scale. Awesome. Okay.
Pretty well.
I have a question, Jaime.
Who do we got?
Hey, it's Dosh.
Hey, Dosh.
What's
Going
going on?
How
Great
you
presentation. I'm doing good.
I'm glad you're here again.
I'm glad to be here. Yeah. Your mustache is looking beautiful. So
You like it. I knew
like
you
it.
would.
I had a question relating to the square and compasses, as they could have some correlation to the 7 liberal arts and sciences. The square being the quadrivium, perhaps, and the compasses being the trivium, square being, things to do with our earthly nature, and the compasses being the heavenly nature. Did you find any kind of research that correlated the 7 liberal arts and sciences to the square and compasses?
I did make a connection in terms of, first, the simple one, just in terms of shape. The 2 points and the sort of connecting point of the origin of those 2 subtending legs, the catheti of the compasses. So that being 3, a triangle, and of course the square, fourth part of a circle and how that relates to aspects, square aspects and things. So I did get into, I didn't necessarily relate it to the entirety of the trivium and the quadrivium and make that differentiation. But I did get into the astrological kind of aspect delineation of those two, and how that kind of makes sense, at least in the domain of what we would say astronomy in the seven liberal arts, or in the quadrivium. So I guess I would have to say nothing worth isolating.
Okay.
Yeah. That I found. But
yeah,
but
it seems like there might be some relationship, just because the square being, the number 4 and everything that's to do with 4, and the compasses being perhaps related to the heavens, which was oftentimes symbolized by the number 3. So I've always intuited that there's probably some relationship between
well, yeah,
them, but
they do say the other name for the quadrivium is the artes physicae. The artes physicae. So these physical arts, of course, would be more readily symbolized by a square, which sort of denotes materiality, cardinality in the directions and things like that, and it just denotes the earth. Look at the astrological and alchemical glyph for earth. It is a circle with the cardinal directions in it, right? So the fourth part of a circle, I mean, we literally see that in the glyph for the earth, and thus denoting a square. So I could see that these artes physicae, or the quadrivium, have a direct correspondence. Now I think making the correspondence from the compasses to the trivium is a little more, again, there's the one where you have the point of origin and the 2 subtending points of the compasses, thereby making 3 points, right? So there's that numerological kind of geometrical link between the trivium and the compasses. But apart from that, I mean, maybe you could say, since the trivium are more language arts, and they're more, I guess, internal arts, because it's not something like the physical arts, which are demonstrable and testable and subject to experimentation and everything in nature, or in the outer world, in the physical material world, thus the square. I don't think you might be able to say something like the language arts are more philosophical. You're dealing with logic, you're dealing with these more, let's say, noumenal arts as opposed to phenomenal arts. So that's about as close as I can get to that.
that makes sense. Thank you.
Well, looks like we got a couple more minutes. I know there's another presentation. It won't be on refracted light, but they're starting at 10 o'clock, and I know some other folks wanted to see. Adam, did you have any other awesome words of wisdom?
No, I ran out of words of wisdom. I just want to say thank you so much, Brother Jaime. Wonderful presentation tonight. We're honored that you did it with us, and on behalf of Worshipful Master Pedro Guerrero, we just really appreciate you doing this tonight and look forward to your next presentation.
Well, please give my best, and again, deepest condolences to Worshipful Brother Pedro, and thank you to all of you. No.
Why don't you just close us out and thank you for your comment, David, and Jaime, why don't you just leave us with some final words of wisdom?
Hey, I really appreciate you making the time to come check out my presentation. I hope you enjoy the book. I give an extensive sort of historical context for each of the subjects. So don't think that you're going to go into it and just see a bunch of esoterica that you're not going to understand, because that's not the case, because I build everything up from the ground up. I do give my my particular brand of critique on it, right, from that perspective, but I also place it in historical context, and you'll see what I mean. And it's, again, meticulously cited. I don't think anybody should be able to find any kind of problem in that regard. So I hope you enjoy it. I hope you give it to the next fellowcraft you guys pass. And if you've ever been a fellowcraft, I feel like, most people need a book like this. I haven't seen a work that covers this ground to this extent. So I'm just saying, I hope you appreciate it and find value in my labors. And thank you. Thanks a million. Many thanks. 1,000 thanks. 1,000 blessings.
Well, we love you, Jamie. And so just finally to close out, then I'll just echo, what Joe and Jamie have already said on behalf of Refracted Light and Benjamin B. French 15. Thank you all for calling in this evening. It's wonderful to see you all. And I'm sure we'll be putting out something new very soon. Thanks, everyone.
Good night, all. Love you all.
Bye.
Bye.